I've been ruminating and reflecting on Dragon Age The Veilguard for a while now, even before its release, trying to understand its position in the history of gaming broadly, and RPGs specifically. And strange as it may sound, I actually think it's an incredibly important game. Not important, mind you, in any positive sense, but rather in the sense of the milestones it has set in the most negative way possible, as I do believe there will be many consequences to the aftermath of its release in years to come. Dragon Age The Veilguard has achieved a great deal, but not likely what it originally sought out to achieve, and its legacy will surely echo throughout the gaming world in years to come. Let us begin then with the most immediate consequences, specifically the Dragon Age IP itself. In an earlier video covering the masterful Illuminati retcon ending, I mentioned that this serves as a placeholder for a potential hard reboot of the Dragon Age series, but at the same time, the game not having any DLC, and the story of Solas having been concluded, it lends itself to the possibility of the story of Dragon Age being over as an IP. Somewhat surprisingly, it turned out that the story of Dragon Age was just the story of Solas all along at the end of the day, and with his story being over, it seems more likely that this is the last of what we will ever see of Dragon Age. On top of that all, many people, including myself, have found our interest in playing the Dragon Age classics, such as Origins, severely atrophied, as the lore conclusions of Dragon Age The Veilguard have left a permanent taint on the game. Dragon Age The Veilguard may well just be fan fiction, and its writing quality reflects this, but it has thoroughly tainted the lore and the story legacy of the previous entries in the series, such that they are now unplayable for many of us. After almost 10 years of development, and hundreds of millions of dollars having been spent, nigh 1 month after its release, it does not seem likely that Dragon Age The Veilguard will ever be able to recoup its losses. Steam data suggests that concurrent players are less than 10,000 at the moment of making this video, and even the reviews on Steam that are positive are mixed, peppered with significant criticisms such as this. Now look at the cons compared to the pros. Is this really a positive review? Even the most diehard of Dragon Age fans, the ones who had gone through every game in the series and enjoyed each for its own qualities, have struggled to come to terms with the teen fanfic masterpiece called Dragon Age The Veilguard, and that says a lot. The only ones who have remained truly steadfast in their devotion to the Dragon Age IP are the most blind loyalists of BioWare, who will greenlight anything BioWare puts out and drool over it in near religious fervor because that is all their echo chamber allows them to do. Those people, and the few whose obsession with pixelated romance is so great that they will forego any semblance of good storytelling to experience the climax of their own version of virtual gooning. So, unless EA and its shareholders turn out to be especially masochistic, there appears to be no logical reason as to why Dragon Age should be greenlit for further games. And I think that is for the best, ultimately, as we come to the next consequence of Dragon Age The Veilguard, BioWare itself. Based on the news, it seems to be the case that BioWare is now moving on to the next Mass Effect entry in the series with full steam ahead. Dragon Age The Veilguard is done, in more ways than one, I might add, and all hands are on deck for Mass Effect. This strikes me as BioWare's last hope, but how much reasonable hope can one have when it comes to Mass Effect? As I've said many times, a name is just a name, and without the people to back it up, it's essentially irrelevant. Whatever hype and hope surrounds the next Mass Effect game, it is heavily laden with worry and concern. Indeed, even the most die-hard of the BioWare acolytes are huffing copious amounts of copium, praying to the gods that somehow, some way, Mass Effect won't turn out to be just another fecal matter show. People forget too easily that BioWare has not put out a game that could even remotely qualify as good for almost a decade. And going back even further, the games of the early 2010s began to show some real issues. For example, the infamous triple rainbow color ending of Mass Effect 3. What is the actual evidence that the next Mass Effect will be anything even worth talking about? It's scant at best, and at worst non-existent. BioWare magic has become the BioWare blight, it seems. Only this time around, they have no one to pop the blight boils for them. Virtually all of the relevant people who made the original Mass Effect are gone, save for a handful, and have moved on to new projects, Exodus being the most prominent among them, which I have discussed extensively on my channel. So whatever the next Mass Effect game is, it will not be what people wish it to be, and I suspect as BioWare has attempted to cater to a new demographic with Dragon Age The Veilguard, they will be, for better or worse, forced to cater to said demographic again, further alienating their old audience, and likely in the process dissolving the last tepid and tenuous bonds of trust BioWare had once engendered. It is absolutely true that Mike Gamble, a project director and executive producer of BioWare, and the head of the current Mass Effect project, has stated that Mass Effect will be photorealistic and that the tone will be mature in an effort to differentiate his game from the poorly crafted Disney clone adventure we've all come to adore called Dragon Age The Veilguard. This statement was clearly made to distinguish the game he is working on from the disaster he knew Dragon Age The Veilguard would be and knows is, but as the old saying goes, by their deeds you shall know them. Talk is cheap, and BioWare has created a legacy of poor quality games, one after the other. Should we then uniquely grant clemency to Mass Effect 5 based simply upon a vague promise made on Twitter? I think not. BioWare has earned our distrust, thoroughly, our criticism, and yes, after the way they've hacked the Dragon Age IP to unrecognizable pieces, our scorn. There is not a shred of evidence that rabid political activists will not be prioritizing their politics over gameplay and story in the next Mass Effect game, irrespective of the tone, or that we can even know what Mike Gamble means by mature tone. It's all hot air as far as I can tell from this vantage point, and BioWare has earned the skepticism by repeatedly failing its customer base. One can only be fooled so many times, and for most of us, frankly speaking, the jig is up. And speaking of politics in games, I think it's now the appropriate juncture to talk about a fairly complex topic, and one that I had partially but insufficiently addressed in my video on Avowed, as many people had been comparing that game to Dragon Age The Veilguard. So let us address the huge glaring elephant in the room, politics in games. And I can think of no better example of the worst application of this than Dragon Age The Veilguard. Where do we even begin? Now I have to say at the outset that we first need to deal with the term wokeness, because I think we are currently experiencing a sort of overcorrection that borders on mania. I might even go so far as to call this woke derangement syndrome. Now, when I made my video about Avowed, primarily to demonstrate that there is not much evidence that it is woke, some of the comments and reactions really surprised me. These comments were so extreme that I cannot possibly repeat them here because it would endanger my channel. And even if that were not the case, I wouldn't want to, because frankly speaking, I found them pretty disgusting and beyond the pale of anything reasonable. But I also realize that such people who make such comments are a small fringe, and don't make up the majority of people who are just plain tired of politics being shoved down their throats, and here is where I would begin to make the distinction between something being woke and something not being woke. The fundamental problem with labeling everything woke is that if everything is woke, then nothing is woke. There are entire lists compiled online that are meant to serve as a guide for what is woke and what is not. And some of these lists include such games as Elden Ring and Baldur's Gate 3, among others. And let's be honest, not too many people are upset about these games. And I think it serves to illustrate a point. While some games might have features that people associate with overt political messaging, the real problem is things being shoehorned in and being shoved down your throat. Very few people, though they do exist, are upset about BG3 or Elden Ring because they are quote-unquote woke, because most people love those games and can ignore whatever messaging might be in there. The real issue is the in-your-faceness of it all, so to speak. But there is yet another layer of complexity here. Many people have talked about Dragon Age The Veilguard and its many problems, and some of them will say something along the lines of the following. The political stuff is the least of the game's problems, and in some sense, this is absolutely true. The game is just a cesspit and smorgasbord of poor quality and mediocrity on most levels, but people who make that comment are also missing a major and very important contributing factor here. The makers of Dragon Age The Veilguard are essentially political activists, and you can confirm this by either going to their Twitter/X or their new hub, Blue Sky, where they endlessly tweet about American politics and the American election. What they tweet about is more often than not politics and not games, and they value politics above games. and therein lies the rub. People who prioritize political messaging over making a good product with good story, mechanics, and companions are virtually destined to deliver slop upon release by dint of the fact that they value their political ideology over the art they're making. Now, it's ultimately about the incentives. And we see this by means of a character such as Tosh. Tosh is possibly the worst written character in the history of BioWare. But the reason why that was the case is because the politics were more important to the writers than making a convincing and interesting character that fits within the greater world of Dragon Age. We didn't get that. Instead, we got an obnoxious, petulant teenager that's about as unlikable as they come because the message was more important than artistic integrity and quality. In this sense, political activists who make games do make games noticeably worse because of their political priorities, which supersede the desire for quality in their games. The bottom line here is that the over-focus on real-world politics automatically overshadows any potential for a good game because game quality is de facto a much lesser priority for them. Thus, while it's technically true that the real-world politics are only part of the problem of Dragon Age The Veilguard, it also reflects a greater disregard for producing a good product and is, therefore, a major problem seen from this light. It should be obvious to anyone who can think that no one likes being preached to, or even worse, being bashed over the head with a cudgel with an unavoidable message that they don't care about. In fact, if you want them to care even less about the message, this is how you do it. This at its core is what people are upset about, and why very normal people are tired of the constant real-world politicking of games. Most people play games to relax, escape their real-world woes, and just want to have a good time. And this is so elementary an observation that it beggars belief that the developers are not aware of this, which allows for only one conclusion. They are aware of this, and they don't care, because they care much more about their political and ideological messaging than making good and fun games. People are just plain tired of it. And Dragon Age The Veilguard is the latest and perhaps most egregious episode of a trend that has been ongoing for far too long. In summary, you cannot have your cake and eat it too. If you care more about real-life politics than making good games, you won't be able to deliver on the latter, and you shouldn't even be making games in the first place. Over the course of several videos, I've seen a number of people mention the topic of gatekeeping within the context of gaming, and whilst I cannot claim to know exactly what they mean by this, it is something that I've given much thought to given the existence of Dragon Age The Veilguard and the Dragon Age IP more generally. In a sense, the Dragon Age IP is a poster child for a lack of gatekeeping. For a set of very specific reasons, BioWare was allowed to be taken over by overzealous political activists, and parts of the player base began to reflect this. And by this, I mean the loudest parts. And for the reasons explained above, prioritizing politics over fun never ends well. So there's actually ample reason to recommend gatekeeping. But what kind? Well, I don't think hardcore you cannot play this gatekeeping is good, or warranted, or even necessary, as it might prevent people who are legitimately interested in a genre from trying out a game they might truly enjoy, and they might like it for what it is. So instead, I've come up with a concept I refer to as soft gatekeeping, and it's both very simple and very effective. Soft gatekeeping basically entails creating a core audience and sticking with that audience and expanding upon it by building upon all the core elements that went into the game that originally attracted said audience. A great example of this would be Kingdom Come Deliverance, and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. The kind of audience attracted to play in this game is very specific, with particular needs, wants, and preferences for games, and in some sense it's a reflection of the developers themselves, Warhorse Studios, who have a similar outlook and mentality to the customer base they're making the game for. They are not political activists, nor are they interested in injecting superfluous social messaging into their games. You have a fixed protagonist, Henry, who's an integral part of the story, going from part 1 to 2 of the games. And not everyone will want to play somebody like that, but they don't need to, because Warhorse Studios does not need to please the whole world. They just need to make games they think are good, and the customers and money will come. And most importantly, the IP will automatically remain insulated and gate-kept because political activists have no taste for it. That is what I call soft gatekeeping. Another good example of this would be my favorite studio, Owlcat Studios, who make autistically long and complex CRPGs and focus on story, companion, and gameplay mechanics in isometric worlds. I've come to learn by observation that most isometric games seem to work almost as if kryptonite against political activists when it comes to the gaming world, even if in theory they might have interest in infecting them too. The isometric perspective is a turnoff for them, as well as Owlcat's extremely complex gameplay mechanics. These types of features keep people who love the games happy and content, wanting more in the future, as Owlcat expands upon their formula for making games and keeps the wrong people out by just sticking to that formula and not attempting to cater to the entire world. As many people have said, a game made for everyone is a game made for no one. And just imagine the outrage, and justifiably so, if some new form of mutated activist tried to turn The Sims into a Call of Duty-like game. I would be upset for The Sims players and sympathize with them. But when Sims players, political activists, and pixel-horny fanfic writers fundamentally change the games we like, our complaints, concerns, and worries are unjustified. You don't get to have your cake and eat it too. It just doesn't work that way. Soft gatekeeping is an easily implemented and elegant solution to the problem of outside interests that are hostile to the core games and their player base without actually being exclusionary, since anyone can go play the games as they are, but no one can actually change them. And since the core elements of such games act as a natural repellent for those who would like to change them, specifically the kinds that led to the destruction of the Dragon Age IP, such people will inevitably stay away. It's a win-win for everyone. So I would say that despite Dragon Age The Veilguard being a terrible game, its existence can serve as an important lesson for both developers and gamers on what not to do to an IP, as the only people interested in burning a once beloved IP down to the ground are people who are so concerned about political messaging that they actually forget they're making a video game, and in their hatred towards fun and quality, destroy everything they touch. Let Dragon Age The Veilguard serve as a lesson for all of us so that its mistakes, and the mistakes that took place in the broader Dragon Age IP, are not repeated again in other franchises. We can only hope that this will be the case, as time will tell, and only the gods can truly know what lies in store for us. But in any event, if you like my video content and my takes, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. It's much appreciated, as it helps out with the algorithm and the growth of the channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.